Hey guys, it's Rush. Hope we're doing well. Welcome back to the channel. This video today, I want to go over 3 control pads which I've used in the past that I'm revisiting. The reason for this video, it is to share the latest information about these 3 controllers. But I also have tried them more recently just to go back to them and see how I find them playing Street Fighter 6. So starting off with the Hori Fighting Commander, this is the Switch version. This was my go-to pad in Street Fighter 5. I used the PS4 version. This is the Switch version, which is pretty much the same, but there are 2 differences. One only minor, one quite major. The minor difference I found is the D-pad on this controller is a lot more stiff compared to the PS4. Now on the PS4 version, it would become loose. The D-pad would become very wobbly, very loose over time. You'd have to replace them every, say, 6 to 9 months, depending on how much you played. But this feels a lot more stiff, which is good in some ways, but it does make your movement quite difficult at times. And the other thing that's different about this controller is you can map all 10 of the buttons, so the 6 face buttons and the 4 shoulder buttons. You are not able to do that on the PS4 version. So after plugging the controller into my PC and navigating to Steam, the controller is recognized as an Xbox controller, so it's using X input, and you can test or configure the buttons here. So I can do setup device inputs and I can configure each of those 10 buttons. So now if you look at the pad viewer, you'll see all buttons are mapped, all 10. So the 6 face buttons and all 4 shoulder buttons, which is a massive improvement over the PS4 version. I always sang this controller's praises. It's very well designed in terms of shape, ergonomics, the layout of the buttons. The shoulder buttons, they're quite unique on this controller because they're small and stubby, but they're very easy to reach. You don't accidentally press them. There's a lot of space between them. The fact that they've increased the surface area at the top and designed them in this way where they're like chunky, fat buttons with a lot of space between them really makes the shoulder buttons feel great for fighting games. The only downside to this pad, I always said this was the D-pad. It can be quite restrictive. It can be a little inaccurate when you try and do fast movements. In Street Fighter 6, it's very common to do a Dragon Punch input and get a super input. But that really is the only drawback. The B-top controller was very similar to this. The differences were that it was quite thin, small in comparison to the Fighting Commander, but it did have a better D-pad overall. Next on the list is the Retrobit Sega Saturn Pro controller. This I reviewed on the channel some time ago and I sung this controller's praises in respect to the D-pad. It's based on the Sega Saturn controller. It has a Sega Saturn style D-pad. It is quite small, but it has 10 buttons and it even has analog sticks, which is nice. Now the reason why I never used this controller for fighting games is because it only supported wireless. There was no wired support. But there has been a firmware update. You have to download the firmware from Retrobit's website and then apply it to the controller. But with the firmware update, you can use this controller wired. I really like this controller because of the D-pad. Now it has wired support. That's huge. It's quite small, quite thin. It's not as thin. I'd say it's a bit more chunky. It's heavier than the B-top, but it is still quite small. And the more I use it, that does come into play. I notice how small it is. With the shoulders, they are quite close together, but they are a decent size. They're bigger, way bigger than the B-top, so I like that. But the rear buttons, I don't really mind this too much, but they're more like paddles rather than actual buttons. But it's not too bad, and they protrude over the controller, which I think is quite nice. But the issue with this pad, there's actually 2 issues with the controller. The first one, and I mentioned this in the original video, is that the Z button and the C button overlap with LB and RB. Now, that isn't too bad because that means you've got 8 buttons, but the issue with this is my traditional layout would be used the 6 face buttons and RB and RT. I was never really too bothered about using these 2 buttons on Street Fighter 5. I do use LT on Street Fighter 6 for drive impact, but because these 2 buttons eat these 2, it means I'm restricted to just using the LT and the RT, which is a problem for me. So it makes it very difficult to map the controller how I want to. I've looked into ways to do this through software, but this is a hardware feature. These 2 buttons coincide with these 2 buttons on the PCB. So that really stings this controller in terms of its functionality, design, just its flexibility to be used in fighting games. I feel like it's more geared towards classic games. That's what it's built for, and that's what it does. But I just don't understand why, if you were to make a controller that's a modernized version, why you wouldn't have all 10 mappable buttons. The analog sticks can be pressed down, so you have left stick button, right stick button. I always feel like left stick button, right stick button should also be mappable as buttons on the face of the controller. So whilst yes, you can use that functionality through the analog sticks if you're playing a third person shooter, also have that mappable somewhere on the pad for fighting games. I mentioned another flaw with this pad, and I've noticed this when I've been using it in Street Fighter 6, is it feels like the pad disconnects or loses connectivity. So I'll be playing and I feel like the pad stall. Doesn't happen very frequently, but I noticed it does that. And how I spotted this is I'll be playing Street Fighter 6 and I'll notice the game will sort of freeze very briefly. Now, I don't know if it's an issue with my connectivity to the PC, if it's the wire that I'm using. I don't have an issue with that wire on other devices. It seems to be with this controller. So I noticed that when I was streaming Street Fighter 6 where the game would just very briefly stutter. And I think it's the controller because I don't get that issue with any other pad, any other device. I thought it was my PC at first. I thought I was dropping frames, but I think it's the control pad. And the other nitpick about this control pad is the face buttons. I understand that this is based on the Sega Saturn controller, but we have the old school, the lower layer of buttons being chunky and the top buttons being quite small. They're trying to encapsulate the Sega Saturn style in recent times, but I do feel changing these buttons out for these size and shape buttons will be so much better in terms of design. So the last controller we'll talk about is the Sanwa Direct, this monster of a controller. So this pad is developed by a company out of Asia. So they're not very well known outside of that region. They seem to make a number of devices for PCs, not just control pads, but they've made a sort of fight pad. And I use this primarily for Tekken. It was really good for Tekken 8 when I was playing Tekken 8. The main drawback I mentioned when I first reviewed it was the button mapping. There were problems with the button mapping. I couldn't use the buttons in the way I wanted to. But going into Steam, similar like we did to the Switch controller and mapping your buttons, you can actually map so many buttons. So you can map the 6 face buttons. You have a 7th face button. This one does sit a little lower than these 6, so it makes it quite hard to find if you're trying to use it for like clutch inputs. And you can also map the 4 shoulder buttons all individually, so you technically have 11 mappable buttons. What's interesting about this D-pad is, even though it looks completely insane, it's very stable. It doesn't wobble at all, but your inputs are super clean on this, and this is why I use it for Tekken. I found it really good for motion inputs on Tekken and for directional inputs, so you do get the best of both worlds. And in the original video I did sing this D-pad's praises. I said it's really, really good. It was the button mapping that was the issue for me. It's very big in size. It's super chunky. It has a large surface area for those shoulder buttons. So these shoulder buttons, they're actually very similar to the Hori Fighting Commander. I take back what I said. This is very similar to the Hori Fighting Commander. They do sit closer to the edge, but I actually don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's pretty good. It has this gloss finish. You can buy it a matte finish. I only bought it in the gloss because that's all I saw at the time. I don't really like the gloss finish. It's it's very tacky, but a very, very capable controller. One thing I will say is the face buttons are very small. For me, at least, I find them very small. They're not a massive issue using them, but they are tiny. But also, I'd say the other downside of this pad is the quality. It does feel cheap, plasticky, tacky. It does feel that way. What I notice about it when I say it's cheap, so you can see now, I'm trying to press this shoulder button down, but I'm pressing the shoulder button down. So that's what happens when you press it at the back. It's fine. If you try and press it here, I don't know if you can hear that. It gets jammed. It's stuck. I've actually jammed it now. Look at that. It's flat. It's stuck. So you have to press the back to pop it out. I know it's in Tekken as well. It only happened in Tekken, but if I'd go into the photo mode in Tekken, the controller would cause the game to just spin round in circles, and I had no control over that at all. So when you plug the controller in and you navigate to Steam and the controller settings, here it will appear as the Sanwa 400. So yeah, that's the input method it picks straight away. That's the name you see. But if you hold the mode button, it'll switch to X input. There we go. Unfortunately, it does not work with my pad overlay. I have to switch it to the X input for it to work with my pad overlay that you see on screen on the left hand side. But the issue is when you use the X input, that's where the input options get limited. So I have to use the standard input method to enable all the buttons to be mappable. But with this configuration, it's pretty good. You've got so many buttons to choose from. You've got a solid D-pad. You've got a control pad that feels stable in your hands. It's very nice to hold. It feels completely solid. So I have an interesting take now on this. I feel like it's so much better because of the button mapping. That was the main drawback of this controller. But I'm glad that I've revisited all of these control pads to not only share more recent updates, but to show better configurations and just share my opinions on what I feel on these older pads that I have used. So that's it for this video, guys. Hope you've enjoyed. Any questions or any queries, give me a shout as always. If you've used any controllers yourself, let me know your opinions. Let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear back from you. Take care. Catch you in the next one.